Just over 200 years ago, in 1811, Hampton was a very different place from the one we know today. The population was then only about 2,750 in total for all of Hampton and Hampton Wick, for Hampton Hill did not then exist. Only around 1/10 of the current population of the area. The main outline of the modern road plan of Hampton was determined many centuries ago. This was dictated by the 3 through roads as well as the tracks that led to the fields. 2 of the through roads were the Upper Sunbury Road, formerly the Staines Road, and the Lower Sunbury Road, previously the Chertsey Road. The other through road was the Twickenham or Heath Road, now known as High Street. And I realise you're all wondering where's Hampton Hill on here. And it's not on here because this is Hampton, that's St Mary's Church, down by the river, and there's the Lower Sunbury and the Upper Sunbury roads there, and this is the High Street, and the Uxbridge Road traffic lights are just about there, so it's just off this particular map, but we'll move on in a second. Things changed greatly after 1811. The Enclosure Act of 1811 led to the parcelling up and enclosure of the old common land and to the improvement and widening of a number of roads that are reflected on the 1826 enclosure map. So, we've now moved on to Hampton Hill High Street. So this is the Uxbridge Road traffic lights there, that's Uxbridge Road. Those cottages there marked in red are called Pantile cottages, which is quite near the Pantile Bridge, which most of you know goes over the stream that goes into Bushy Park there. And we've got Windmill Road, and then we go up to, well, that's the Hampton Road coming down to Teddington there, so that's where the Hampton Hill traffic lights are. And notice there is no Park Road at this stage because it didn't exist at that time. Right. Before enclosure, the common was a place of furze, briars and heather, used by Hamptonians to graze cattle and cut brushwood for fuel. This land was mainly in the north of Hampton, and what became at first New Hampton and subsequently Hampton Hill. For as I already mentioned, Hampton Hill did not exist at this time. The only properties in this area being the windmill, built in about 1785, on a site opposite the former Windmill pub, 1 or 2 cottages, an upper lodge in Bushy Park. The enclosure also meant that a large grant of land came to the grammar school as owners of the Great Tithes. And you can see I've marked them there in black on that map. This land was a large area on the north side of the Hanworth Road, on which the 3 schools, Hampton School, Lady Eleanor Hollis and Hampton High, now stand. Additionally, the fuel allotment charity was established from the enclosure award in compensation to the poor for the loss by them of the right to gather fuel on the common which had been enclosed. The poor of Hampton were granted 10 acres and the poor of Hampton Wick a further 5 acres. And I've marked them there in the top left-hand corner in red, as you can probably see. The adjoining plots of land were on the northern boundary of the parish, just inside Hampton, on the southern side of Uxbridge Road. In the 20th century, the 5-acre allotment was bought by the council for council housing. And in fact, it's now Winifred Road and Graham Road, for anybody who knows the roads in that area. The 10-acre plot was became in due course St Clair's Nursery and was then sold to Sainsbury's for their new store in the Uxbridge Road, which of course, well, it's opened 30 years ago now, actually opened in 1991, but yes, it doesn't seem possible, it's already been there for over 30 years. At this stage, it is probably appropriate to look, as far as we can, at those early buildings in the area that became New Hampton and then subsequently Hampton Hill. Right, firstly the windmill. The actual windmill, which you can see in this photograph, was built in 1785 and was demolished in 1876, so it was obviously quite an old photograph. It was used to grind corn and barley. Of course, it is still recalled in the name of the Windmill pub that was built in 1868 in what was then known as Mill Lane and rebuilt in 1901 on the same site. And of course, is the present building. The actual building, as we've already heard, stood across the road on the other side of the Longford River. Next, a quick look at Upper Lodge, which we'll be returning to in another guise later on. Montague Dunk, Earl of Halifax, was an eminent minister in Queen Anne's reign and became Keeper of the Bushy Park, Keeper of the Home Park, Steward of Hampton, Keeper of Middle Park and the Hare Warren. He became an MP in 1689 and a Lord of the Treasury in 1692, and the national debt originated from his proposal. He introduced the bill establishing the Bank of England in 1694 and was Chancellor of the Exchequer and a Privy Councillor. Busy man, obviously. When in 1709 Halifax became keeper of Bushy Park, he rebuilt Upper Lodge. He was proud of his gardens, particularly the water gardens, which of course still survive, restored today. In addition to the windmill and Upper Lodge, there were probably a few cottages. The Pantile cottages, which I mentioned earlier, which, as I say there, those marked in red on the corner there, are known to have existed in 1826 because they're on this map, when they were included on the enclosure map, of which this is one of the pages. They were just north of the Pantile Bridge. The first substantial bridge, was built in 1832, although there was probably a wooden bridge before then. And you might just about be able to see, depending where you are, there's a water splash on this side, and there's quite a narrow bridge on that side. So I had a water splash, obviously, for the heavy traffic, and then lighter traffic and pedestrians walked across on the other side. As you approach the bridge from the Hampton direction, up a steadily rising incline, you would have, first of all, seen the bridge, and just beyond it, the very prominent southern-facing sloped roof of the row of Pantile cottages at right angles to the High Street. Thus the bridge became known as the Pantile Bridge. Later, the widening of the High Street to accommodate double tram tracks reached here in 1910, and you can see that process going on in this particular picture here. And the resultant new bridge enabled double tram tracks to pass over it. The cottages are now demolished now, but I'll show you where they were. See where it says TA Centre? Well, that was originally the drill hall, and you can see they're just north of where that building, of course, still survives. But, right, where were we? Oh yes. After the cottages were demolished, the site was used to store very large GPO cable drums. Later it was used as a car park by Four Winds Press. In recent years, the old drill hall, which had opened in 1914, and that's the original plans there, had been extended by the addition of a northern wing connected to a central building to the original drill hall and is now known as Network House. The new northern wing is on the site of the old Pantile cottages. Now, funny enough, I've never seen a picture, and still haven't seen a picture of the Pantile cottages, so if anybody's ever seen one or knows where there is one, I'd be very interested to see it actually. But now's a chance to look at some early maps of Hampton Hill. We've seen the Pantile cottages already on the 1826 map. And on this map, which I'm just about to show you, there we go, it's an 1839 map. Sorry, I lost my place for a second. All the plots are divided up and the roads, Longford River, are on there. Let's have a look. Right, so this is 1839. So this is Hampton Hill High Street coming up here, and again that's the Hampton Road going down to Chennington. And that's Windmill Road there, and then you can see the Longford sort of snaking across the corner there. By 1850 there were 24 traders, including 3 beer retailers. You'll be pleased to know. The population grew in the 1850s and 1860s with the arrivals of labourers building the Hampton Waterworks and the railway. Many of these people were housed in so-called wooden shacks or hovels. The increase in population led to the building of a new church, St James's, and the building of a separate parish, the making of a separate parish in 1863. The first vicar, the Rev F.J. Fitzwigram or Fitzwigram, different people pronounce it different ways. The man we see here was a man of energy and private means. He set about improving the infrastructure of the village, building cottages and houses, and generally improving facilities for the workers, using his own money. That's the sort of vicar you want, isn't it? He was vicar from 1863 to 1881. The second vicar was the Rev H. Bligh, and he was from 1881 to 1893. And the third vicar was the Reverend C.R. Jobe, from 1894 to 1914. So the 1861 population, which was only 710, rapidly increased to 1,322 in 1871, 2,014 in 1881, and to 2,440 by 1891. So in those 30 years, it had gone up by about 3.5 times, which is obviously an enormous increase. Obviously from a low base, because they started off with nothing much at all, really. Let's now have a look at St James's Church. At first, the church which was consecrated at the end of 1863 and was of a fairly boxy shape, was described as a, quote, 91 foot by 24 foot barn, unquote. Many additions and extensions were made over the next 20 years. These included the north aisle and west porch, then the vestry. In 1876, the chancel was enlarged, and then the south aisle and porch were added. To celebrate Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, the tower and spire were put up and completed in 1888. The churchyard was also extended several times. Of course, in more recent times, further additions and alterations have also taken place. The enormous influence of the church, particularly under the first vicar, the Rev. F.J. Fitzwigram, in the area can hardly be overstated. When St James's Church was built in 1863, Park Road, as I've previously mentioned, did not exist. At that time, there was only a gravel track on a parallel line to where the road was later built, and that led to a nursery. This track had to cross the railway, newly built in 1863 by a narrow wooden bridge, to obtain access to the other part of the nursery that had been bisected by the railway line. St James's Church was still in the middle of fields at this time. Later, in around the late 1860s, both ends of Park Road were built, but they did not initially join across the railway. So you can see in that picture there the kink, which is necessary because that's Sherwood's nursery in the middle there, and the two bits of the road didn't line up with that particular bridge. After this, Sherwood's nurseries built a new wooden railway bridge across the railway. This bridge was on a different alignment to the road and reduced this sharp kink either side of the bridge. The present brick bridge replaced the wooden bridge in September 1904 and allowed the road to be straightened out and the kink eliminated. By the 1870s and 1880s, many new roads, including Park Road, had been built, and a large area was now covered by nurseries and greenhouses. The principal growers were Sherwoods, Pages, Gills and Milnes. Flowers, particularly carnations and daffodils, were the main crop. Right, next we're going to look at a specific example of some of the buildings at the southern end of High Street in the 1880s to try and gain a better idea of what things were like at that time. We'll start off with a map, and then we're going to be talking in this area here with this red arrows. You can see it says Smithy there, so we're talking that area there. Right, so to do this, we're going to use a picture from what are known as the borough plans and available to look at and download online. The borough plans are the most significant addition to the local studies collection in decades, I believe. There is an absolute treasure trove of information contained within them, just waiting to be discovered. And even better, you can access the plans online from the comfort of your own home. I've chosen the example to show some of the information that can be gleaned. I hope this will give some food for thought in how we can all potentially start to explore this fantastic resource. Right. So this plan we're going to look at, as you can see, is a very simple plan. And you may even ask why we're looking at such a superficially mundane plan at all. Well, the basic reason is this plan shows information that's probably not available from any other source and takes us back to the early days of Hampton Hill. Firstly, we have to identify the area depicted in the plan, as it's an 1887 plan with no address other than High Street, Hampton Hill. The clues are in the picture. On the left, we have a licensed beer house, and at the top we have Bushy Park, marked above a sloping wall line that narrows as it goes from left to right. If you know the geography of the area, then there's only one place that this can be, and that is the Star, then a beer house and now a pub of the same name, with the wall of Bushy Park behind and plots that gradually get narrower to the right, that is south. As you can see, I've marked those features on there. The planning application is for a proposed building, which I've also marked in red, to be used as a coach builder's show shop, marked in red, as I just said in the plan. The other items marked on the plan are a house and a shed to the left of the proposed building, which are contained within a yard that also houses workshops at the top of the yard, and also a wash house, outside WC, cesspool and woodshed. In the next plot is a carman's yard, which I've marked there in green. It is likely the first yard contained the proposed coach builder's show shop building, and the workshop it contained were being used by a coach builder. Indeed, a subsequent check of the 1894 OS map shows it then marked as a smithy, as we saw a few minutes ago. It was often the case that a coach builder or blacksmith would be next to a pub, or beer house in this case. We have other cases in Hampton, and I'm sure other parts of the borough would be the same. This would be the case because there would often be land available, and the pub would also be a natural place to stable horses and to conduct running repairs to coaches, etc. The carman's yard adjoining is a place where carts were stored, ready to transport goods around. All in all, this was marginal land, right at the extreme south of the High Street, on very narrow plots abutting the park wall. These businesses and the neighbouring agricultural properties take us back to the very early days of Hampton Hill. There were, in essence, as we've already seen, no buildings in Hampton Hill before the 1811 enclosure. The only exceptions I previously mentioned being Upper Lodge, the windmill, and a few cottages. The Star was probably built in 1862, and the coach builders may also date to around that time. And now, with the aid of this plan that we just saw, we can see all the detail of the building in the yard, which would not be available from any other source. If we can do this with other buildings, we can begin to construct a much more detailed view of these early days of Hampton Hill. Now, almost all the buildings in this picture were demolished in the 1904-1908 period. And we're talking, as you can see there, the Star public house there with a house with a white front, and what was the old fire station. This fire station here, only built in 1897, was demolished 7 years later in 1904, and a new fire station built in Windmill Road, later becoming an extension to the library next door, until the library moved to a new building in the High Street in recent years. The face of Hampton Hill changed very significantly after the introduction of trams in 1903. Initially, much of the line along Hampton Hill High Street was single track, with passing loops. From 1904, buildings were demolished in order to accommodate double tram tracks and were rebuilt further back on their sites. It took until 1910 to complete these works. Apart from the buildings we've just seen that were demolished and not replaced on the eastern side of the High Street, there were a number that were demolished on the western side of the High Street as well. In general, the ones on the western side were rebuilt, set further back on their plots to accommodate the wider road and therefore the double tram tracks. These included the Crown and Anchor at the corner of Windmill Road and High Street. This is a nice picture. It seems to have come into being sometime after 1825. It was demolished in August 1908 and the business transferred to a temporary building in Windmill Road. The new Crown and Anchor was erected shortly after, set back on the same site. And if you look carefully at this picture, and I apologise for the red splodge, I should have digitally removed it, but I didn't get around to doing it. That's the new Crown and Anchor there, but can you see this building here? It's had its roof messed around with. You can see the wooden beams to it, and there's advertising hoardings. What they've obviously done is chopped off 6, 8, 10 feet, whatever, of that building, and they're moving it back effectively by removing that, and then they'll fill in where the hoardings are, and that'll have the effect of setting the building back. That's the new pub on the corner there as well. So as I say, the new Crown and Anchor was erected shortly after, set back on the same site. The pub was transferred to Watney Combe and Reed in 1924. The name was changed to the Valiant Knight around 1980. Some people may still remember that, I don't know. And the premises at 99 High Street were then used as Joe's Restaurant, and more latterly have been used as La Familia Restaurant. Whilst on the subtopic of pubs, we'll have a look at some others, and why not? To the south of the Crown and Anchor, there was the Rising Sun at 29 High Street, which stands at the corner of Park Place and High Street. It is not known exactly when it came into existence, although it is mentioned in the 1871 census and was possibly built a few years before then. The property was purchased in 1880 by Ferrari Mutes Company and was made a full-on licence in 1953. We've already touched on the Star, of course, when looking at the plans a few minutes ago. Later on, we know from building applications, there were alterations to the Star in 1902. It is highly likely that these are a result of the changes the High Street brought about by the coming of the trams in 1903. We know in 1921 that there was an addition to the Star, and this was an extra room at the southern end of the premises, i.e. the right end of the building when viewed from outside. So you may be able to see there that this new bit is going away on a slope. They're not building to the original building line, but they're widening the road, or had widened the road for the trams. And you can see again in that picture that bit of the pub is set slightly further back than the rest of the original pub. We've already covered the Windmill Public House earlier, and so turned next to the Jolly Gardeners at 94 Uxbridge Road. And before the talk started, I was talking to somebody who used to live on that site, in fact. The pub is originally believed to have been in existence before 1850. At this time, the section of modern-day Uxbridge Road past the Jolly Gardeners was known as Mill Road, and the section beyond the junction with modern-day Windmill Road was called the Hounslow Road. The pub came into the possession of Whately Combe Reed in 1924 and closed in the year 2000. The property was then converted for housing use with additional housing built on the site. Right, now back to the High Street and the Duke of Clarence. The exact age of the Duke of Clarence at 147 High Street is unknown, although there is some evidence of an older building on the same site. If the name is anything to go by, then it would indicate a date prior to 1830, when the Duke of Clarence became William IV. The pub was refronted and greatly extended in 1925 to give a very different appearance. In recent years, it has rather sadly, in my opinion, lost its ancient name and become the bloated Mallard. Across the street until recent times was the Jenny Lind at 80 High Street. It was built in 1839 and named after the singer of that name, who was also known as the Swedish Nightingale. And these plans show alterations made to the pub in 1908. And this next image dates the 1930s and shows an outing just about to depart from the pub. And the premises, as you may know, have been converted to a KFC. What can you do, eh? Swedish Nightingale to KFC. These next two pubs are not actually in Hampton Hill, but are so close to the borders that many regarded them as being in Hampton Hill. The first was the Duke of Wellington. A director of 1839 actually lists the Duke of Wellington under what was initially called New Hampton, before the name was officially changed to Hampton Hill in 1890. The Duke of Wellington, now converted to housing, which in fact is just outside Hampton Hill in Teddington, came into existence before 1816. It was then in the occupation of Joseph Burton, who no doubt gave his name to the adjacent Burton's Lane, which formed the boundary. The second pub is the Roebuck. The border between Hampton Hill and Teddington cuts across the Hampton Road just in front of the Roebuck, which is in Teddington, and leaves Bushy Park Garden in Hampton Hill before turning south across Bushy Park. As it's in Teddington, I've not looked into its history. We're very parochial in the local history trade, but as it's a good pub and so close to the border, I thought it would be only fair to include a picture. Next we turn to the rather more sombre topic of the First World War. And I think the First World War did have a local impact on Hampton Hill. We know that in November 1914, Belgian refugees began to arrive at Laurel Dean, for instance. On a more mundane level, we also know that Hampton Hill Football Club was abandoned as 17 members had joined the services. Rather than look at a random list of different impacts on the area, we're going to look in more detail at one particular aspect. This was a convalescent hospital in Hampton Hill and housed at Upper Lodge in Bushy Park. The large number of casualties of World War I necessitated the use of many buildings for temporary use as hospitals. One such building was Upper Lodge, which was used as the King's Canadian Convalescent Hospital from December 1915 until May 1919. Much of this following information comes from so-called war diaries that were kept by the hospital, and these enable us to gain an insight into what went on at this institution a century ago. In a historical recap, this source records, quote, "The King's Canadian Red Cross Convalescent Hospital is situated in Bushy Park, Hampton Hill, Middlesex, England." These are Canadians writing this. "In what was for many years the residence and grounds of Lady Paget. It is the property of the Crown, which loaned for hospital purposes to the Canadian Red Cross Society, the Manor House," their words, not mine, "the buildings appurtenant thereto, together with the lodge and grounds, known as Upper Lodge, free from rent or payment of other taxes. The hospital was opened for the reception of patients in December 1915, initially with 30 beds. On the 31st of December 1915, all the beds were occupied by patients. Her Majesty Queen Mary visited the hospital on the day the furniture arrived, 22nd of December 1915, and was greatly interested in the efforts being made to have everything in good running order at the earliest possible moment. Extensive works were undertaken in the grounds where, through years of disuse and neglect, the gardens, grounds and orchard had been allowed to run wild. Walks and paths were cleared, vegetation cut back, and flower beds planted. An extensive vegetable garden was weeded, dug and planted, and trees in the orchard pruned and sprayed. The narrative records that Upper Lodge was transformed into a veritable Garden of Eden. The report continues. A dispensary, dental clinic and laboratory were added to the administrative buildings. It might be here mentioned that all the new buildings were constructed with asbestos walls on brick foundations, not something you'd necessarily be boasting about these days, I guess. Similarly built huts with accommodation for 250 patients were completed in June 1916. In another section of the grounds, a billiard room for patients, as well as a commodious concert hall and recreation room combined. A spacious physical training and gymnasium building was added in the autumn of 1916, but owing to the incessant demand for accommodation for patients, this building was soon fitted up as a hospital ward, and a new and larger physical training pavilion erected in the autumn of 1917. The hospital was visited by the King and Queen on the 16th of March 1916, although the car became embedded in mud as they approached the main gateway. You can't imagine Queen Mary would not have been amused, and they completed their journey on foot. The average number of patients in the hospital in November 1916 was approximately 335, 75 of those being amputation cases. The diary for the 1st of April 1917 records that, quote, "This hospital passes from the control of the Canadian Red Cross Society to that of the military authorities, the state, and that during the past 15 months, over 3,700 patients have passed through this hospital. All the systems in all departments were then reorganised as the hospital had now been taken over by the Canadian government. Special clinics were established for patients with heart disease and what was called trench nephritis. This latter condition had arisen among soldiers in spring 1915 and was characterised by breathlessness, swelling of the face or legs, headache, sore throat, and the presence of albumin and renal casts in urine. Trench nephritis was a serious problem for the Allies, leading to 35,000 casualties in the British and 2,000 in the American forces. There were also hundreds of deaths. No significant preventative methods were implemented for trench nephritis. Inevitably, some patients died, and some of them had funeral services and were buried at St James's Church. Others were taken back to Canada or to other places. In January 1918, it seems that supplies were still fairly plentiful, although this is about to change. The Quartermaster's report for January 1918 records, quote, "The supply of comforts for patients of their recreative needs," I guess that's a Canadian word, I don't like recreative, anyway, that's what it says, "has happily been well looked after by the Canadian Red Cross Society and the provincial governments. The plentiful supply of cigarettes, tobacco, shaving kit bags and other articles of utility and comfort, recreative equipment, there's that word again, reading matter and generous supplies of luscious BC apples," which I guess are British Columbian apples, "have added greatly to the happiness of our patients undergoing their special treatment at this hospital." The Quartermaster's report for the following month tells a different story of economies and the planting of additional land to grow as much as possible. In April 1918, supplies were not as plentiful as previously, and so-called, this is a nice Orwellian word, new dieting with smaller portions of meat were introduced. By June, shortages were obviously much worse, and it's been recorded that meat rations are being substituted for 4 days in the week. A considerable amount of garden produce has been placed on the tables. Although the war had ended in November 1918, the hospital continued until May 1919, when instructions were received that remaining patients had to be transferred by the end of the month, and to the complete close of the whole institution at the earliest possible date. The nephritic clinic had always kept meticulous monthly and cumulative information on patients. Its final report of the 31st of May 1919 says that the total number of patients admitted since the inception of this clinic a year earlier was 1,491. Of these, 28% were invalided to Canada, 62% were discharged to various categories of active duty, and the remaining 10% were mainly still being treated or convalescing. The Special Heart Clinic did not keep cumulative information, but also dealt with very large numbers of patients during this period. By the middle of July 1919, almost all the staff had gone, and the hospital was officially disbanded on the 2nd of September 1919. In the postscript, the buildings were then adapted by the London County Council as a residential open-air school for London boys, and named the King's Canadian School. This was provided accommodation for 290 boys at a time, and around 3,500 boys a year stayed at the school. It was mainly actually for people, particularly in the poorer parts of London who had chest diseases or other sort of respiratory things, and I think they thought, and probably rightly, that some time in the fresh air could, do nothing but assist. You'd like to think so anyway. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Upper Lodge was requisitioned by the Air Ministry. The requisition was transferred to the Admiralty in December 1945 for use as an extension of the Admiralty's research laboratory based at the nearby National Physical Laboratory, NPL, at Bushy House. In recent years, all the additional buildings were demolished and the house has been converted for use as a private residence. The water gardens running past the property have been restored, as we know, and open to the public. Right, we now turn to the story of one particular property in Park Road and some discoveries that were made there under the floorboards. The lease for the land on which present-day number 3 Park Road, Hampton Hill, was built dates back to 1867, when a 99-year lease was signed. The house itself is a few years younger. A document of 1870 states that, quote, a house of not less than £50 per annum rental value is to be erected. There's no mention of the property in the 1871 census, but a later document in 1878 refers to the premises. In all likelihood, the house was built in the early 1870s. The land on which the property was built was in fact in 2 parts. The smaller section forming the rear part of the present back garden was formerly part of the long narrow strip of back garden belonging to Suffolk House in High Street. The premises of Suffolk House are now occupied by the Cavern Bakery. The main part of the land, like much of the land near to St James's Church, was glebe land, i.e. was owned by the church before being built on. We can tell the occupiers of the properties in late Victorian times, the time frame we were looking at, in 1881, 1891 and 1901, from the census, of course. In brief, the occupiers in 1881 were somebody called Emily Clement, a Prussian-born teacher of chemistry, and his wife, it's also called Emily, but without the E between the L and the Y, with 1 son, 3 daughters and 2 servants. By 1891, the house was occupied by John Tomlinson, a registered practitioner, probably a doctor, and his wife Louisa with 2 sons and 2 servants. In 1901, Percival Turner, a medical transfer agent, and his daughter and 4 sons are listed. There's no mention of a wife, but with a governess and a niece who was a domestic help. When major restoration of the property was being undertaken, a good number of Victorian and other items were discovered. Here we see some of what were under the floorboards. These items were quite likely posted through cracks in the floorboards by the children in the household, I imagine. At any rate, we get a brief late Victorian Hampton Hill time capsule dating from, it seems, the 1880s and 1890s. So the first thing here is a part of an envelope addressed to Mrs. Clement, and therefore must date to the 1880s. It's part of a postcard from a bank dated 1889. It's a luggage label addressed to Tomlinson, so it must date to the 1890s. Note the address of 1 Edinburgh Villas, now 3 Park Road. And here we have some birthday, Christmas and greeting cards. Very typically sort of Victorian designs here, probably 1890s by looking at the design. And again another very typically late Victorian image. And this is quite interesting. There's a couple here, decorative items. This appears to be a Sikh soldier in sort of military uniform, as it were. I'm guessing there's some kind of game, because this next one is obviously part of the same thing, and you can see it shows the back and the front of the same pair of people. So I guess next, a couple of price tickets. So my feeling here is that these were probably in joints of meat, and quite possibly were the price, not per pound, but the price of that particular joint. Because as you can see, that's 1 6 3 farthings. So I think it's a rather precise amount per pound, but it might be logical to have that for a joint. And similarly, this one's 4 of them, but halfpenny, as you can see. Right, there's a bit of packaging. This is something which is pure. But, looks like the man on the Quaker Oat packets, but I'm not sure whether it is or not. But anyway, it's a Quaker person. Holden cigarettes. I think it's his First World War, actually. And when you look on the back, it says leading generals at the war, so I'm sure this is the First World War. And now some small toys. So we can see there obviously a gun, a figure which I guess would have been sitting on a carriage or whatever at some point. It looked like a little pocket watch. Anyway, all of these were underneath the floorboards in that particular property. So it's pretty rare actually to get a little time capsule like that, which has been undisturbed for well over a century. But, thank goodness for small boys and small girls posting through things down through the floorboards, I guess. Right, next we'll have a brief look at what was long a prominent business in Hampton Hill, Pruitt's Dairy. The site of the dairy itself, behind this high street, was developed for housing in 2003. However, the dairy shop and its facade have been retained in different use, but still visible, of course. The dairy was certainly there in the 1890s, and probably started in the 1880s. Pruitts used to do their milking in sheds behind the shop, but later their cows were at Chessington and Leatherhead, and that sheds were converted to house their electrically operated milk floats. It is recorded that the yard behind the shop is remarkable for its picturesque bell tower, which was bought together with the bell, which weighs 500 weight, by the late Mr. T. Pruitt from an estate in Coombe Hill. He goes on to say that Mr. Pruitt also laid down the ornamental garden flanking the shop. I guess people don't necessarily take quite so much care to lay out their shops and adjoining ornaments these days. Later, the dairy was taken over by Job's Dairy, and the site, as I mentioned, has now been redeveloped. Another long-running business in the High Street was Makepieces, who ran the post office for many years. In 1835, the post office building was occupied by Edwin Makepieces' printing firm. The post office took over half the building in about 1840, whilst the printing works, once owned by Mr. W. Austin, continued to do business until at least the 1960s under the name or the title of the Hampton Press. And you can possibly see there the H, which is the Hampton Press, and there's some typical 1960s scooters in the front there as well, as you can see. In March 1891, the Surrey Comet recorded that the post office clock, which Mr. Makepeace has in a public-spirited manner provided for the convenience of inhabitants at his own expense, is being much appreciated. It is regulated by telegraph every morning at 10 a.m. from the chief London office and gives correct Greenwich time. By 1899, Makepieces at the main post office were advertising postal telegraph on the premises. The post office continued in the same building until a number of years ago, and then moved a few doors up the high street to its present position. Our next topic is of celebrations and processions. The earliest one we have is that of the Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. That didn't work. Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897. This view is looking towards the Star on the old fire station in High Street, as we saw earlier on. Now we have the 1902 coronation of Edward VII. This picture shows, as you can see, the dignitaries parading along Chestnut Avenue in Bushy Park on the way to inspect the troops. At this and other coronations, troops would come from various parts of what was then called the Empire to take part in the coronation ceremonies in London. A number of them were housed in camps in Bushy and Home Parks. Next we turn to the 1911 coronation, and here the procession is passing the Jenny Lind. And Jenny Lind is that building there with the line, big striking line just there. And this is the 1919 peace celebration. You can just look out, see the Star with white frontage there. And by this time, all those buildings we saw very early on have been demolished and are just behind these hoardings. And that's where those buildings, including the old fire station, were at one time. So the 1937 coronation of George VI, we can see here. And this is the programme for the events that were held in the paddock in Bushy Park. And this next view shows a float about to enter the gates into the park. Note, you can see part of a notice on the left-hand side, which would have said in full, London County Council, King's Canadian School, which we touched on previously, and that was housed in Upper Lodge, of course. Our next coronation is that of the present Queen in 1953. Here we see a programme for one of the coronation sports events, football and boxing, which was also held in Bushy Park. And then to bring us more into living memory, this next view shows part of the parade along the High Street for the 1977 Silver Jubilee near Bert's Cycle Shop on the left-hand side, which you can possibly just see there, the cycle shop there. We'll now have a look at some lost buildings. We've already seen the windmill, of course, earlier, but other buildings have also been lost. Some of the older ones in High Street and others, particularly those on larger plots, have been lost to redevelopment. We'll now have a look at a sample of some of them. If we start on the High Street, we've already seen how the widening for double tram tracks had meant the loss of the original fire station, which, as I mentioned, was rebuilt on Mill Road. and the Crown and Anchor pub, which was rebuilt further back on the same site and now known as La Familia. There were other buildings that have been converted, such as Clarence Terrace, which we can see here, until very recently partly occupied by Barclays Bank, until banks became unfashionable. Now we don't have any more of them. This building features in what is one of the earliest pictures of the High Street, about 1880, when, as you can see, the road was still unsurfaced. There's some other fine buildings in the High Street, including this one, which was called Cicestra, and the Hermitage. The distinctive house known as the Hermitage, which was set back a short way from the east side of the High Street, not far from the junction with Hampton Road, is believed to have come into existence a little after 1811. It stood next to Templeton House, which still survives. The building shows marked Strawberry Hill influence, not only in appearance, being built in the pseudo-Gothic style, but also in its name as well. The ground on which it stood, together with that of Templeton House next door, was sold by auction on May the 9th, 1817. The Hermitage was demolished in December 1964. Here you can see some of the chimney pots that have been removed, no doubt to be salvaged by a builder for a large sum of money, I expect. Another road which had and still has some very large houses was St James's Road. Most of the large houses that once lined St James's Road have now been replaced by blocks of flats or other dwellings, although a number still bear the original name of the property. One of these was Larkfield, which was occupied by Mrs Fitzwigram, widow of St James's first great vicar. After her husband's early death, she moved across St James's Road into Larkfield and then proceeded to make it the centre of church life. Another was Walton Lodge, now replaced by flats of the same name. This was later used as a children's home. On the other side of St James's Road was a large house called Murray House, M-U-R-R-E-E, built for the Butler family on their return from Indian service, who were a well-known gentry family, active in the parish and generous to local causes. I thought it would be interesting as we come towards the end of our journey around various aspects of Hampton Hill history to have some now and then and now, comparisons to see how, in part, Hampton Hill has changed over the years. The southern end of the High Street, which we see here, has altered very little, really, over the last 100 years. If you ignore the satellite dishes in the modern view, then the United Reformed Church has lost its little spire that we see in the earlier picture, and the only other main difference is the tram lines in the earlier view. This next view is Windmill Road. The old cottages near Hampton Hill Junior School are shown in 1863, shortly before demolition. The same view at the present day shows Fitzwigram Close, named after the first vicar, of course, built in 1965. This view at the northern end of High Street, at the junction with Park Road, has also not changed so much in a century. Of course, the traffic lights in the modern view have replaced the tram lines in the earlier picture. The light-coloured building in the earlier picture was the Victoria Hall. This view on Hampton Road towards the traffic lights with High Street shows that these houses in the shop at the corner of Hampton Road and Alpha Road have since been replaced by newer houses and a new block of flats. Right, this next comparison shows Laurel Dean in 1963 and in more recent times. Laurel Dean was a very large house with extensive grounds, and by about 1960 the house was used as a nursing home. New accommodation for the elderly has since been built in the grounds and opened around 2001. The old property, when I wrote this talk originally, still survived, but in a dilapidated condition, as we can see in this photo. And I went on to say, I imagine the decay has got worse and blah, blah, blah. But of course, in actual fact, what happened, as some of you may remember, is that a so-called extension was built onto the building there. Well, that seemed to involve demolishing almost the whole of the old building, leaving a short stretch of two walls and building an enormous thing, which is about 3 times the size of the previous house. But I guess as it was technically an extension, it was allowed, but a bit surprising that it got through, but there you go. And finally, and probably appropriately, on the very border of Hampton Hill, we have a view of Burton's Road. This is taken in snow in about 1909, from the edge of the railway bridge, looking towards High Street. The housing on the left-hand side of the road, of course, was not built in the earlier picture. Right, and then just show you a close-up of the earlier one. The buildings of Deacon Howe Farm are just to the right of the trees, which you can probably see there, and the Duke of Wellington is in the far distance. The Duke of Wellington, which we saw earlier on, which of course is now converted to housing. Burton's Road, or Burton's Lane, was a very old, possibly 17th century track, and forms the boundary of Hampton Hill and Teddington. Well, that brings us to the end of our journey around Hampton Hill tonight. We've looked at the village in the very early days and many of the developments that have subsequently taken place. We've seen the impact of St James's Church, as well as the coming of the trams, and had a brief tour around all the old pubs. The First World War led to the establishment of a hospital in Upper Lodge, and we saw how a great many people passed through this establishment. On a lighter note, we had a Victorian time capsule of items from under the floorboards and some of the village celebrations. We've also been able to see a number of lost buildings and then taken a look at some then and now images to help visualise some of the changes of the last century and more. I hope you enjoyed this overview and some of the village history of Hampton Hill, and this may encourage some of you to delve a little more into the local past, for there's a rich archive of discoveries still to be made. Thank you.